Hello, I'm Christine Ridarsky, and I serve as Rochester's officially appointed government historian and as the Director of Historical Services for the Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County.
And I'm Antoine McDonald. I am a Rochester native and I have worked at the Central Library for 3 years. I recently transferred to the Local History and Genealogy Division. I am currently the only African American male librarian in the Rochester Public Library system.
Today's talk is part of the 2021 Tuesday Topic Series presented by the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. We are here to share with you a vision for a more inclusive history of Rochester and to talk about the library's intentions for making that vision a reality. Over the past 8 months, since George Floyd's death reinvigorated the Black Lives Matter movement and renewed protests against systemic racism, and Daniel Prude's death brought the issue home to Rochester, we as a community and as a nation have sought to understand how we got to this point and what we can do to remedy the injustices that endure in our society. As Rochester reckons with its history of white supremacy and racism, the past provides important lessons.
Unfortunately, most of the archival materials housed in the community's cultural institutions tell history through the white middle-class lens that has predominated traditional historical narratives. In order to right these wrongs and develop a more inclusive understanding of the past, we need to ensure that the historical record reflects all of our city's residents and their experiences by collecting materials that document the experience and viewpoints of underrepresented people. That is why the Rochester Public Library has begun working with community partners to interrupt racism by reflecting on our past, complacency, committing ourselves to a future of continued action, and establishing an archive of Black history and culture. Our talk today will explore the limitations of existing archival collections and discuss the need to decolonize the archives and what that means. We will explain the actions we have already taken and the various methods we plan to use to engage with stakeholders in order to identify and assess community needs and desires, such as surveys, focus groups, and discussions with community partners. We will also discuss the various tools we will be employing in collecting both physical and digital materials and making them accessible to the public. We believe that this project represents an acknowledgement of our role in contributing to existing limitations as an institution throughout history, as well as a milestone movement to eliminate those limitations in pursuit of a more equitable historical record of our community.
These conversations began many months ago when I, as the city's historian and manager of the library's archives and special collections, began to face a lot of pressure to document the Black Lives Matter protests in our community, beginning after the death of George Floyd and then escalating after news broke that Daniel Prude had died during an encounter with Rochester police. I felt uncomfortable taking the lead in this and began to push back and ask questions. Was it appropriate for a white historian working for a predominantly white institution to make choices about how to document the movement, including what to collect and how? What were the implications of documenting the moment while protests were still happening? Could my work actually put protesters in danger by gathering evidence that law enforcement could use against them? And what about the trauma factor? Was I equipped to interact with people whose own trauma was being triggered by the violence they were seeing and experiencing? I also had to consider how materials collected now would complement existing collections. What had we done in the past to document the communities who were calling for equity? And what could that work tell us about how to approach the current moment?
The answer was disappointing, though not surprising. While the library and other local institutions prided themselves on documenting our most notable African American residents, such as the great abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass, and on capturing oral histories with civil rights activists, records of our other Black Rochesterians and their experiences were spotty at best. And what was available sometimes painted unflattering pictures of the lives of Black Rochesterians, as demonstrated in traditional interpretations of the racial uprising of 1964, which blamed African American residents while failing to look at the root causes of the unrest. Recognizing these gaps and inaccuracies, we begin to devise a plan to reevaluate the library's existing collections and collection policies and to intentionally turn our attention to documenting underrepresented groups. The result is an action plan for creation of a community curated archive of Black history and culture. We are using a framework developed by UCLA Studies professor Michelle Caswell as a guide. Caswell outlines a process for identifying and dismantling white supremacy in archives, a process also known as decolonization. The need for decolonization stems from the history of colonization, in which a dominant group, in our case, white Europeans, imposed its belief systems and values on another group, such as indigenous Americans and Black Africans, and thereby devalued and delegitimized the values and beliefs of the non-dominant group. The result in archives has been that materials documented through a white middle-class lens have been valued and therefore preserved, while items that explore the past through other lenses have not. Decolonizing archives requires us to change the lens, to look at the past, present, and future from a more inclusive viewpoint that values and preserves multiple perspectives.
Maxwell tells us that this process requires us to reevaluate every aspect of our approach to archives, from what we collect and the language we use to describe materials, to how and to whom we provide access. We also have to consider who works in archives and how they are trained. Are there barriers that are preventing archives from being inclusive? We recently assembled a team of library staff, all people of color, to begin the process of evaluating existing library collections and policies according to Caswell's principles. We will begin by reviewing collections that are already in our archives. To what extent are people of color represented? And equally as importantly, is the language we use to describe collections material inclusive, or does it reflect outdated or biased interpretations of the history and subject matter? Once we've identified problem areas, we'll determine how to address them. We also need to look at our appraisal policies. Do we need to revise them to ensure that they reflect our commitment to equality and to equitably representing and serving the entire Rochester population? If not, we will need to revise those too. The same is true of our access policies. Archives and archivists have long sought to find balance between protecting history and historical materials and sharing those materials so that people can learn from them. But have policies such as requiring users to show identification before allowing them to use archives and special collections, have those policies kept some people from accessing the collections? Have we inadvertently put barriers in place?
As part of our project, we also have committed to increasing opportunities for people of color to advance within the library field. As I mentioned in my introduction, I am the only Black male librarian currently working in the Rochester Public Library system. We have more female librarians of color, but overall employees' demographics are not representative of the overall community that we serve. We need to ask why and to intentionally seek to recruit and develop African American employees. We are grateful to the Rochester Regional Library Council, which recently awarded us a special grants project that will allow us to enroll 10 library employees currently working in job titles ranging from clerk to library assistant to Librarian and a month-long Basics of Archives course. We will also be hosting 2 workshops on identifying and dismantling white supremacy in archives, which will be open to staff from all RRLC member libraries. Our hope is that this training will help to increase the pool of library staff of color who are prepared to take on new roles, not only within the new archive of Black history and culture, but throughout the library system as a whole.
Of course, none of this work is happening in a vacuum. As we noted earlier, our plan is to develop a community curated archive with the emphasis on community. That necessarily means that members of the broader community will have to have a large stake and a great deal of agency in this process. Our intention is to establish a paid community advisory board comprised of people who represent the communities we seek to document. This board will set the mission, vision, and priorities for the new archive. We feel that paying the members of this board for their service and expertise is important. Too often in the past, white people have undervalued the contributions of Black people. We are currently seeking funding for this purpose. In the meantime, we've already developed important partnerships with individuals and community organizations that have been working to preserve the history of their families and communities. There's surprisingly a lot of this work happening in the community that we may not yet be aware of. Over the past couple of years, staff in the library's local history and genealogy division have been working with people and Bunton families to organize and preserve a collection of their personal objects and archives. Together, these materials document 5 generations of a single African-American family. The family and their collection is the focus of an exhibit that opened last year on the 2nd floor of the Rundle Memorial Building. We invite you to visit as soon as the library reopens. Titled Everyday People, the exhibit explores the family's migration from Culpeper, Virginia to the town of Wheatland and then to Rochester. It looks at everything from the family's life on Clarissa Street, which was the historic heart of Rochester's African-American community, to various family members' involvement in the civil rights movement, and even at more mundane activities, such as the work a father and his sons did to lead and participate in the local Black Boy Scout troop. You can learn more about the exhibit and the family that inspired it at next week's session of Tuesday Topics. Curators Michelle Finn and Emily Morey will tell you a little bit about the exhibition development process and interview Jerry Bunton and Karen Dinkle Bunton about Karen's family history and the collection that they donated to the library.
We have also been working with the Clarissa Street Reunion Committee and Teen Empowerment to archive oral history interviews local youth recorded with elders who lived on Clarissa Street in Rochester's Cornhill neighborhood in its heyday. These recordings formed the basis for a 2020 documentary film entitled Clarissa Uprooted. The film recalls the vibrant African-American residential, business, and entertainment district before it was demolished during urban renewal and highway construction in the middle of the 20th century. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend you Google it and watch it. It will give you a sense of the history we seek to preserve. The next phase of our work on Clarissa Street involves developing a crowdsourcing process to collect and digitize additional oral histories, photographs, and documents. These will be used in a youth-curated exhibit being produced by Teen Empowerment's Youth History Ambassadors and an augmented reality tour of Clarissa Street being developed by an RIT professor. And of course, the material will be archived online and in the library where it will be available to future researchers. The Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library is supporting this project through funds raised on Rock Day 2020. We also are in conversation with the Urban League of Rochester to assist with another oral history collection project and to archive materials being gathered for another youth-produced exhibit. Over the next few months, we hope to launch a new digital oral history collection platform that will make it easier for residents to share their stories. The project will rely on technology developed by tech entrepreneur Zach Ellis and his Their Story platform.
Our plan for making the archive of Black history and culture a reality is complex and still requires funding, but we believe that we have a solid plan for moving the project forward over the next year. We have already mentioned that an internal planning team has begun meeting and that we are raising money to compensate members of a soon-to-be established community advisory board. We are also seeking funding to hire a project director and other staff. Together, the advisory group and staff will identify and connect with other community stakeholders, conduct research to identify themes, organizations, and individuals significant to Rochester's African American residents, past and present. They will also survey stakeholders and hold public meetings to assess community needs and desires. We want to do what the community wants and needs. They will also be involved in identifying additional archival materials that need to be preserved. As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of work happening in the community already at a grassroots level, but we need to ensure that that material gets preserved in a place where it remains accessible for future researchers. Finally, these groups will work to develop a mission statement, vision, strategic plan, and collection policy for the new archive.
All of this work is intentionally building toward our goal of interrupting racism by ensuring that going forward, the library's archives and special collections reflect the full history of all of Rochester's residents, past, present, and future. If you would like more information about this initiative or would like to support us, please feel free to contact either one of us. Thank you and have a nice day.